Hi guys, how you doing? So I'm gonna be continuing on with my blanket. I'm just going to share out here and try not to go for a nap. Cause, nap, share on Twitter. And at me. And let's see. And at me again. Notifications. Retweet with the comment. Book club. No. Oh, I wish I could remember that shortcut key. Why can't I remember it? You know, guys, do you know why I can't remember it? I just realized I hadn't changed those letters yet, or numbers, or whatever. I just don't know why my brain just won't let me remember that shortcut key. 'Cause reasons. Book club. Let's see. PWT Book Club. There. And there we go. Tweet. Delete. There we go. 'Cause why remembering what tweeters are is apparently not good. Nope. And there we go. My Bememberer is working apparently sometimes. Not all the time, most of the time. Once in a while. YouTube, nope. Twitter, yep. New followers, CBM Book Club, there we go. And put in the new people and the spaces. Actually, we'll put a space, hard space in there, enter shift up space. Okay. Cancel. Save and close. There. Much better. Now I don't have to remember how to do that all the time. So we're going to be doing Hey Critical. How are you doing? Save it. I am going to be doing the 2 books. Which 2 books? I'm not sure. The Wind in the Rose Bush by Mary E. Excuse me. Oh my gosh, will I stay awake? Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. And A Halloween Wrath by William Black. Or Halloween Wraith, not Wrath. I don't know. I'll let the authors tell you, or the readers tell you. So, where is it? Where is the mute? Where is the silence mute?
The Wind in the Rosebush by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Simmons. The Wind in the Rosebush by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Ford Village has no railroad station, being on the other side of the river from Porter's Falls, and accessible only by the ford which gives it its name, and a ferry line. The ferry boat was waiting when Rebecca Flint got off the train with her bag and lunch basket. When she and her small trunk were safely embarked, she sat stiff and straight and calm in the ferry boat as it shot swiftly and smoothly across stream. There was a horse attached to a light country wagon on board, and he pawed the deck uneasily. His owner stood near, with a wary eye upon him, although he was chewing, with as dully reflective an expression as a cow. Beside Rebecca sat a woman of about her own age, who kept looking at her with furtive curiosity. Her husband, short and stout and saturnine, stood near her. Rebecca paid no attention to either of them. She was tall and spare and pale, the type of a spinster, yet with rudimentary lines and expressions of matronhood. She all unconsciously held her shawl, rolled up in a canvas bag, on her left hip, as if it had been a child. She wore a settled frown of dissent at life, but it was the frown of a mother who regarded life as a froward child, rather than as an overwhelming fate. The other woman continued staring at her. She was mildly stupid, except for an overdeveloped curiosity which made her at times sharp beyond belief. Her eyes glittered. Red spots came on her flaccid cheeks. She kept opening her mouth to speak, making little abortive motions. Finally, she could endure it no longer. She nudged Rebecca boldly. "A pleasant day," said she. Rebecca looked at her and nodded coldly. "Yes, very," she assented. "Have you come far?" "I've come from Michigan." "Oh," said the woman with awe. "It's a long way," she remarked presently. "Yes, it is," replied Rebecca conclusively. Still, the other woman was not daunted. There was something which she determined to know, possibly roused thereto by a vague sense of incongruity in the other's appearance. "It's a long ways to come and leave a family," she remarked with painful slyness. "I ain't got any family to leave," returned Rebecca shortly. "Then you ain't—" "No, I ain't." "Oh," said the woman. Rebecca looked straight ahead at the race of the river. It was a long ferry. Finally, Rebecca herself waxed unexpectedly loquacious. She turned to the other woman and inquired if she knew John Dent's widow, who lived in Ford Village. "Her husband died about 3 years ago," she said by way of detail. The woman started violently. She turned pale, then she flushed. She cast a strange glance at her husband, who was regarding both women with a sort of stolid keenness. "Yes, I guess I do," faltered the woman finally. "Well, his first wife was my sister," said Rebecca, with the air of one imparting important intelligence. "Was she?" responded the other woman feebly. She glanced at her husband with an expression of doubt and terror, and he shook his head forbiddingly. "I'm going to see her, and take my niece Agnes home with me," said Rebecca. Then the woman gave such a violent start that she noticed it. "What is the matter?" she asked. "Nothing, I guess," replied the woman, with eyes on her husband, who was slowly shaking his head like a Chinese toy. "Is my niece sick?" asked Rebecca with quick suspicion. "No, she ain't sick," replied the woman with alacrity. Then she caught her breath with a gasp. "When did you see her?" "Let me see. I ain't seen her for some little time, replied the woman. Then she caught her breath again. She ought to have grown up real pretty, if she takes after my sister. She was a real pretty woman, Rebecca said wistfully. Yes, I guess she did grow up pretty, replied the woman in a trembling voice. What kind of a woman is the second wife? The woman glanced at her husband's warning face. She continued to gaze at him while she replied in a choking voice to Rebecca. I guess she's a nice woman, she replied. I don't know. I guess so. I don't see much of her. I felt kind of hurt that John married again so quick, said Rebecca. But I suppose he wanted his house kept, and Agnes wanted care. I wasn't so situated that I could take her when her mother died. I had my own mother to care for, and I was school teaching. Now Mother has gone, and my uncle died 6 months ago and left me quite a little property, and I've given up my school, and I've come for Agnes. I guess she'll be glad to go with me, though I suppose her stepmother is a good woman and has always done for her. The man's warning shake at his wife was fairly portentous. I guess so, said she. John always wrote that she was a beautiful woman, said Rebecca. Then the ferry boat grated on the shore. John Dent's widow had sent a horse and wagon to meet her sister-in-law. When the woman and her husband went down the road, on which Rebecca in the wagon with her trunk soon passed them, she said reproachfully, Seems as if I'd ought to have told her, Thomas. Let her find it out herself, replied the man. Don't you go to burning your fingers in other folks' pudding, Maria. Do you suppose she'll see anything? Asked the woman with a spasmodic shudder and a terrified roll of her eyes. See, returned her husband with stolid scorn. Better be sure there's anything to see. Oh, Thomas, they say... Lord, ain't you found out that what they say is mostly lies? But if it should be true, and she's a nervous woman, she might be scared enough to lose her wits, said his wife, staring uneasily after Rebecca's erect figure in the wagon, disappearing over the crest of the hilly road. Wits that so easy upset ain't worth much, declared the man. You keep out of it, Maria. Rebecca, in the meantime, rode on in the wagon beside a flaxen-headed boy who looked, to her understanding, not very bright. She asked him a question, and he paid no attention. She repeated it, and he responded with a bewildered and incoherent grunt. Then she let him alone, after making sure that he knew how to drive straight. They had traveled about half a mile, past the village square, and gone a short distance beyond, when the boy drew up with a sudden "whoa" before a very prosperous-looking house. It had been one of the aboriginal cottages of the vicinity, small and white, with a roof extending on one side over a piazza, and a tiny L jutting out in the rear, on the right hand. Now the cottage was transformed by dormer windows, a bay window on the piazza-less side, a carved railing down the front steps, and a modern hardwood door. "Is this John Dent's house?" asked Rebecca. The boy was as sparing of speech as a philosopher. His only response was in flinging the reins over the horse's back, stretching out one foot to the shaft, and leaping out of the wagon, then going around to the rear for the trunk. Rebecca got out and went toward the house. Its white paint had a new gloss. Its blinds were an immaculate apple green. The lawn was trimmed as smooth as velvet, and it was dotted with scrupulous groups of hydrangeas and cannas. I always understood that John Dent was well-to-do, Rebecca reflected comfortably. I guess Agnes will have considerable. I've got enough, but it will come in handy for her schooling. She can have advantages. The boy dragged the trunk up the fine gravel walk, but before he reached the steps leading up to the piazza, for the house stood on a terrace, the front door opened, and a fair, frizzled head of a very large and handsome woman appeared. She held up her black silk skirt, disclosing voluminous ruffles of starched embroidery, and waited for Rebecca. She smiled placidly. Her pink double-chinned face widened and dimpled, but her blue eyes were wary and calculating. She extended her hand as Rebecca climbed the steps. "This is Miss Flint, I suppose," said she. "Yes, ma'am," replied Rebecca, noticing with bewilderment a curious expression compounded of fear and defiance on the other's face. "Your letter only arrived this morning," said Mrs. Dent in a steady voice. Her great face was a uniform pink, and her china blue eyes were at once aggressive and veiled with secrecy. "Yes, I hardly thought you'd get my letter," replied Rebecca. "I felt as if I could not wait to hear from you before I came. I supposed you would be so situated that you could have me a little while without putting you out too much, from what John used to write me about his circumstances, and when I had that money so unexpected, I felt as if I must come for Agnes. I suppose you'll be willing to give her up. You know she's my own blood, and of course she's no relation to you, though you must have got attached to her. I know from her picture what a sweet girl she must be, and John always said she looked like her own mother, and Grace was a beautiful woman, if she was my sister." Rebecca stopped and stared at the other woman in amazement and alarm. The great handsome blonde creature stood speechless, livid, gasping, with her hand to her heart, her lips parted in a horrible caricature of a smile. "Are you sick?" cried Rebecca, drawing near. "Don't you want me to get you some water?" Then Mrs. Dent recovered herself with a great effort. "It is nothing," she said. "I am subject to spells. I'm over it now. Won't you come in, Miss Flint?" As she spoke, the beautiful deep rose color suffused her face. Her blue eyes met her visitor's with the opaqueness of turquoise, with a revelation of blue, but a concealment of all behind. Rebecca followed her hostess in, and the boy, who had waited quiescently, climbed the steps with the trunk. But before they entered the door, a strange thing happened. On the upper terrace, close to the piazza post, grew a great rose bush, and on it, late in the season though it was, one small, red, perfect rose. Rebecca looked at it, and the other woman extended her hand with a quick gesture. "Don't you pick that rose," she brusquely cried. Rebecca drew herself up with stiff dignity. "I ain't in the habit of picking other folks' roses without leave," said she. As Rebecca spoke, she started violently, and lost sight of her resentment, for something singular happened. Suddenly the rose-bush was agitated violently, as if by a gust of wind, yet it was a remarkably still day. Not a leaf of the hydrangea standing on the terrace close to the rose trembled. "What on earth—" began Rebecca. Then she stopped with a gasp at the sight of the other woman's face. Although a face, it gave somehow the impression of a desperately clutched hand of secrecy. "Come in," said she in a harsh voice, which seemed to come forth from her chest with no intervention of the organs of speech. "Come into the house. I'm getting cold out here." "What makes that rose-bush blow so, when there isn't any wind?" asked Rebecca, trembling with vague horror, yet resolute. "I don't see as it is blowing," returned the woman calmly, and as she spoke, indeed the bush was quiet. "It was blowing," declared Rebecca. "It isn't now," said Mrs. Dent. "I can't try to account for everything that blows out of doors. I have too much to do." She spoke scornfully and confidently, with defiant, unflinching eyes, first on the bush, then on Rebecca, and led the way into the house. "It looked queer," persisted Rebecca, but she followed, and also the boy with the trunk. Rebecca entered an interior, prosperous, even elegant, according to her simple ideas. There were Brussels carpets, lace curtains, and plenty of brilliant upholstery and polished wood. "You're real nicely situated," remarked Rebecca, after she had become a little accustomed to her new surroundings, and the two women were seated at the tea table. Mrs. Dent stared with a hard complacency from behind her silver-plated service. "Yes, I be," said she. "You got all the things new?" said Rebecca hesitatingly, with a jealous memory of her dead sister's bridal furnishings. "Yes," said Mrs. Dent. "I was never one to want dead folks' things, and I had money enough of my own, so I wasn't beholden to John. I had the old duds put up at auction. They didn't bring much." "I suppose you saved some for Agnes. She'll want some of her poor mother's things when she is grown up," said Rebecca with some indignation. The defiant stare of Mrs. Dent's blue eyes waxed more intense. "There's a few things up garret," said she. "She'll be likely to value them," remarked Rebecca. As she spoke, she glanced at the window. "Isn't it most time for her to be coming home?" she asked. "Most time," answered Mrs. Dent carelessly. "But when she gets over to Addie Slocum's, she never knows when to come home." "Is Addie Slocum her intimate friend?" "Intimate as any." "Maybe we can have her come out to see Agnes when she's living with me," said Rebecca wistfully. "I suppose she'll be likely to be homesick at first." "Most likely," answered Mrs. Dent. "Does she call you mother?" Rebecca asked. "No, she calls me Aunt Emmeline," replied the other woman shortly. "When did you say you were going home?" "In about a week, I thought, if she can be ready to go so soon," answered Rebecca with a surprised look. She reflected that she would not remain a day longer than she could help after such an inhospitable look and question. "Oh, as far as that goes," said Mrs. Dent, "it wouldn't make any difference about her being ready. You could go home whenever you felt that you must, and she could come afterward." "Alone?" "Why not? She's a big girl now, and you don't have to change cars." "My niece will go home when I do, and not travel alone, and if I can't wait here for her, in the house that used to be her mother's and my sister's home, I'll go and board somewhere," returned Rebecca with warmth. "Oh, you can stay here as long as you want to. You're welcome," said Mrs. Dent. Then Rebecca started. "There she is," she declared in a trembling, exultant voice. Nobody knew how she longed to see the girl. "She isn't as late as I thought she'd be," said Mrs. Dent. And again that curious, subtle change passed over her face, and again it settled into that stony impassiveness. Rebecca stared at the door, waiting for it to open. "Where is she?" she asked presently. "I guess she's stopped to take off her hat in the entry," suggested Mrs. Dent. Rebecca waited. "Why don't she come? It can't take her all this time to take off her hat." For answer, Mrs. Dent rose with a stiff jerk and threw open the door. "Agnes," she called. "Agnes." Then she turned and eyed Rebecca. "She ain't there." "I saw her pass the window," said Rebecca in bewilderment. "You must have been mistaken." "I know I did," persisted Rebecca. "You couldn't have." "I did. I saw first a shadow go over the ceiling, then I saw her in the glass there." She pointed to a mirror over the sideboard opposite. "And then the shadow passed the window." "How did she look in the glass?" "Little and light-haired, with the light hair kind of tossing over her forehead." "You couldn't have seen her." "Was that like Agnes?" "Like enough. But of course you didn't see her. You've been thinking so much about her that you thought you did." "You thought you did?" "I thought I saw a shadow pass the window, but I must have been mistaken. She didn't come in, or we would have seen her before now. I knew it was too early for her to get home from Addie Slocum's anyhow." When Rebecca went to bed, Agnes had not returned. Rebecca had resolved that she would not retire until the girl came, but she was very tired, and she reasoned with herself that she was foolish. Besides, Mrs. Dent suggested that Agnes might go to the church social with Addie Slocum. When Rebecca suggested that she be sent for, and told that her aunt had come, Mrs. Dent laughed meaningly. I guess you'll find out that a young girl ain't so ready to leave a sociable where there's boys to see her aunt," said she. "She's too young," said Rebecca incredulously and indignantly. "She's 16, replied Mrs. Dent, "and she's always been great for the boys." "She's going to school 4 years after I get her before she thinks of boys," declared Rebecca. "We'll see," laughed the other woman. After Rebecca went to bed, she lay awake a long time listening for the sound of girlish laughter and a boy's voice under her window. Then she fell asleep. The next morning she was down early. Mrs. Dent, who kept no servants, was busily preparing breakfast. "Don't Agnes help you about breakfast?" asked Rebecca. "No, I let her lay," replied Mrs. Dent shortly. "What time did she get home last night?" "She didn't get home." "What?" "She didn't get home. She stayed with Addie. She often does." "Without sending you word?" "Oh, she knew I wouldn't worry." "When will she be home?" "Oh, I guess she'll be along pretty soon." Rebecca was uneasy, but she tried to conceal it, for she knew of no good reason for uneasiness. What was there to occasion alarm in the fact of one young girl staying overnight with another? She could not eat much breakfast. Afterward, she went out on the little piazza, although her hostess strove furtively to stop her. "Why don't you go out back of the house? It's real pretty, a view over the river," she said. "I guess I'll go out here," replied Rebecca. She had a purpose, to watch for the absent girl. Presently Rebecca came hustling into the house through the sitting room, into the kitchen where Mrs. Dent was cooking. "That rose bush!" she gasped. Mrs. Dent turned and faced her. "What of it?" "It's a-blowin'." "What of it?" "There isn't a mite of wind this morning." Mrs. Dent turned with an inimitable toss of her fair head. "If you think I can spend my time puzzling over such nonsenses," she began, but Rebecca interrupted her with a cry and a rush to the door. "There she is now!" she cried. She flung the door wide open, and curiously enough, a breeze came in, and her own gray hair tossed, and a paper blew off the table to the floor with a loud rustle. But there was nobody in sight. "There's nobody here," Rebecca said. She looked blankly at the other woman, who brought a rolling pin down on a slab of pie crust with a thud. "I didn't hear anybody," she said calmly. "I saw somebody pass that window." "You were mistaken again." "I know I saw somebody." "You couldn't have. Please shut that door." Rebecca shut the door. She sat down beside the window and looked out on the autumnal yard, with its little curve of footpath to the kitchen door. "What smells so strong of roses in this room?" she said presently. She sniffed hard. "I don't smell anything but these nutmegs." "It is not nutmeg." "I don't smell anything else." "Where do you suppose Agnes is?" "Oh, perhaps she has gone over the ferry to Porter's Falls with Addie. She often does. Addie's got an aunt over there, and Addie's got a cousin, a real pretty boy." "You suppose she's gone over there?" "Maybe. I shouldn't wonder." "When should she be home?" "Oh, not before afternoon." Rebecca waited with all the patience she could muster. She kept reassuring herself, telling herself that it was all natural, that the other woman could not help it, but she made up her mind that if Agnes did not return that afternoon, she should be sent for. When it was 4 o'clock, she started up with resolution. She had been furtively watching the onyx clock on the sitting-room mantel. She had timed herself. She had said that if Agnes was not home by that time, she should demand that she be sent for. She rose and stood before Mrs. Dent, who looked up coolly from her embroidery. "I've waited just about as long as I'm going to," she said. "I've come away from Michigan to see my own sister's daughter and take her home with me. I've been here ever since yesterday, 24 hours, and I haven't seen her. Now I'm going to. I want her sent for." Mrs. Dent folded her embroidery and rose. "Well, I don't blame you," she said. "It is high time she came home. I'll go right over and get her myself." Rebecca heaved a sigh of relief. She hardly knew what she had suspected or feared, but she knew that her position had been one of antagonism, if not accusation, and she was sensible of relief. "I wish you would," she said gratefully, and went back to her chair while Mrs. Dent got her shawl and her little white head tie. "I wouldn't trouble you, but I do feel as if I couldn't wait any longer to see her," she remarked apologetically. "Oh, it ain't any trouble at all," said Mrs. Dent as she went out. "I don't blame you. You have waited long enough." Rebecca sat at the window watching breathlessly until Mrs. Dent came stepping through the yard alone. She ran to the door and saw, hardly noticing it this time, that the rosebush was again violently agitated, yet with no wind evident elsewhere. "Where is she?" she cried. Mrs. Dent laughed with stiff lips as she came up the steps over the terrace. "Girls will be girls," said she. "She's gone with Addie to Lincoln. Addie's got an uncle who's conductor on the train and lives there, and he got 'em passes, and they're going to stay to Addie's Aunt Margaret's a few days. Mrs. Slocum said Addie didn't have time to come over and ask me before the train went, but she took it on herself to say it would be all right, and—" "Why hadn't she been over to tell you?" Rebecca was angry, though not suspicious. She even saw no reason for her anger. "Oh, she was putting up grapes. She was coming over just as soon as she got the black off her hands. She heard I had company, and her hands were a sight. She was holding them over sulphur matches." "You say she's going to stay a few days?" repeated Rebecca dazedly. "Yes, till Thursday, Mrs. Slocum said." "How far is Lincoln from here?" "About 50 miles. It'll be a real treat to her. Mrs. Slocum's sister is a real nice woman." "It is going to make it pretty late about my going home." "If you don't feel as if you could wait, I'll get her ready and send her on just as soon as I can," Mrs. Dent said sweetly. "I'm going to wait," said Rebecca grimly. The two women sat down again, and Mrs. Dent took up her embroidery. "Is there any sewing I can do for her?" Rebecca asked finally in a desperate way. "If I can get her sewing along some—" Mrs. Dent arose with alacrity and fetched a mass of white from the closet. "Here," she said. "If you want to sew the lace on this nightgown, I was going to put her to it, but she'll be glad enough to get rid of it. She ought to have this and one more before she goes. I don't like to send her away without some good underclothing." Rebecca snatched at the little white garment and sewed feverishly. That night she wakened from a deep sleep a little after midnight, and lay a minute trying to collect her faculties and explain to herself what she was listening to. At last she discovered that it was the then popular strains of The Maiden's Prayer floating up through the floor from the piano in the sitting room below. She jumped up, threw a shawl over her nightgown, and hurried downstairs trembling. There was nobody in the sitting room. The piano was silent. She ran to Mrs. Dent's bedroom and called hysterically, "Emmeline! Emmeline!" "What is it?" asked Mrs. Dent's voice from the bed. The voice was stern, but had a note of consciousness in it. Who was that playing the Maiden's Prayer in the sitting room on the piano?" "I didn't hear anybody." "There was someone." "I didn't hear anything." "I tell you there was someone, but there ain't anybody there." "I didn't hear anything." "I did. Somebody was playing the Maiden's Prayer on the piano. Has Agnes got home? I want to know." "Of course Agnes hasn't got home," answered Mrs. Dent with rising inflection. "Be you gone crazy over that girl? The last boat from Porter's Falls was in before we went to bed. Of course she ain't come." I heard you were dreaming. I wasn't. I was broad awake. Rebecca went back to her chamber and kept her lamp burning all night. The next morning her eyes upon Mrs. Dent were wary and blazing with suppressed excitement. She kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then frowning and setting her lips hard. After breakfast, she went upstairs and came down presently with her coat and bonnet. "Now, Emmeline," she said, "I want to know where the Slocums live." Mrs. Dent gave a strange, long, half-lidded glance at her. She was finishing her coffee. "Why?" she asked. "I'm going over there and find out if they have heard anything from her daughter and Agnes since they went away. I don't like what I heard last night." "You must have been dreaming." "It don't make any odds whether I was or not. Does she play the Maiden's Prayer on the piano? I want to know." "What if she does?" "She plays it a little, I believe. I don't know. She don't half play it anyhow. She ain't got an ear." "That wasn't half played last night. I don't like such things happening. I ain't superstitious, but I don't like it. I'm going. Where do the Slocums live?" "You go down the road over the bridge past the old grist mill, then you turn to the left. It's the only house for half a mile. You can't miss it. It has a barn with a ship in full sail on the cupola." "Well, I'm going. I don't feel easy." About 2 hours later, Rebecca returned. There were red spots on her cheeks. She looked wild. "I've been there," she said, "and there isn't a soul at home. Something has happened." "What has happened?" "I don't know. Something. I had a warning last night. There wasn't a soul there. They've been sent for to Lincoln." "Did you see anybody to ask?" asked Mrs. Dent with thinly concealed anxiety. "I asked the woman that lives on the turn of the road. She's stone deaf. I suppose you know. She listened while I screamed at her to know where the Slocums were, and then she said, 'Mrs. Smith don't live here.' I didn't see anybody on the road, and that's the only house. What do you suppose it means?" "I don't suppose it means much of anything," replied Mrs. Dent coolly. "Mr. Slocum is conductor on the railroad, and he'd be away anyway. And Mrs. Slocum often goes early when he does, to spend the day with her sister in Porter's Falls. She'd be more likely to go away than Addie." "And you don't think anything has happened?" Rebecca asked, with diminishing distrust before the reasonableness of it. "Land, no." Rebecca went upstairs to lay aside her coat and bonnet, but she came hurrying back with them still on. "Who's been in my room?" she gasped. Her face was pale as ashes. Mrs. Dent also paled as she regarded her. "What do you mean?" she asked slowly. "I found when I went upstairs that little nightgown of Agnes's on the bed, laid out. It was laid out. The sleeves were folded across the bosom, and there was that little red rose between them." "Emmeline, what is it? Emmeline, what's the matter? Oh!" Mrs. Dent was struggling for breath in great, choking gasps. She clung to the back of a chair. Rebecca, trembling herself so she could scarcely keep on her feet, got her some water. As soon as she recovered herself, Mrs. Dent regarded her with eyes full of the strangest mixture of fear and horror and hostility. "What do you mean talking so?" she said in a hard voice. "It is there." "Nonsense. You threw it down and it fell that way." "It was folded in my bureau drawer." "It couldn't have been." "Who picked that red rose?" "Look on the bush," Mrs. Dent replied shortly. Rebecca looked at her. Her mouth gaped. She hurried out of the room. When she came back, her eyes seemed to protrude. She had in the meantime hastened upstairs and come down with tottering steps, clinging to the banisters. "Now I want to know what all this means," she demanded. What means?" "The rose is on the bush, and it's gone from the bed in my room. Is this house haunted or what?" I don't know anything about a house being haunted. I don't believe in such things. Be you crazy?" Mrs. Dent spoke with gathering force. The color flashed back to her cheeks. "No," said Rebecca shortly. "I ain't crazy yet, but I shall be if this keeps on much longer. I'm going to find out where that girl is before night." Mrs. Dent eyed her. "What be you going to do?" "I'm going to Lincoln." A faint triumphant smile overspread Mrs. Dent's large face. "You can't," said she. "There ain't any train." "No train?" "No, there ain't any afternoon train from the Falls to Lincoln." "Then I'm going over to the Slocums again tonight." However, Rebecca did not go. Such a rain came up as deterred even her resolution, and she had only her best dresses with her. Then in the evening came the letter from the Michigan village which she had left nearly a week ago. It was from her cousin, a single woman who had come to keep her house while she was away. It was a pleasant, unexciting letter enough, all the first of it, and related mostly how she missed Rebecca, how she hoped she was having pleasant weather and kept her health, and how her friend, Mrs. Greenaway, had come to stay with her since she had felt lonesome the first night in the house. How she hoped Rebecca would have no objections to this, although nothing had been said about it, since she had not realized that she might be nervous alone. The cousin was painfully conscientious, hence the letter. Rebecca smiled in spite of her disturbed mind as she read it. Then her eye caught the postscript. That was in a different hand, purporting to be written by the friend, Mrs. Hannah Greenaway, informing her that the cousin had fallen down the cellar stairs and broken her hip, and was in a dangerous condition, and begging Rebecca to return at once, as she herself was rheumatic and unable to nurse her properly, and no one else could be obtained. Rebecca looked at Mrs. Dent, who had come to her room with the letter quite late. It was 9:30, and she had gone upstairs for the night. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "Mr. Amblecrombe brought it," she replied. "Who's he?" "The postmaster. He often brings the letters that come on the late mail. He knows I ain't anybody to send. He brought yours about your coming. He said he and his wife came over on the ferry boat with you." "I remember him," Rebecca replied shortly. "There's bad news in this letter." Mrs. Dent's face took on an expression of serious inquiry. "Yes, my cousin Harriet has fallen down the cellar stairs. They were always dangerous, and she's broken her hip, and I've got to take the first train home tomorrow." "You don't say so. I'm dreadfully sorry." "No, you ain't sorry," said Rebecca, with a look as if she leaped. "You're glad. I don't know why, but you're glad. You've wanted to get rid of me for some reason ever since I came. I don't know why. You're a strange woman. Now you've got your way, and I hope you're satisfied." "How you talk." Mrs. Dent spoke in a faintly injured voice, but there was a light in her eyes. "I talk the way it is. Well, I'm going home tomorrow morning, and I want you, just as soon as Agnes Dent comes home, to send her out to me. Don't you wait for anything. You pack what clothes she's got, and don't wait even to mend them, and you buy her ticket. I'll leave the money, and you send her along. She don't have to change cars. You start her off when she gets home on the next train." "Very well," replied the other woman. She had an expression of covert amusement. "Mind you do it." "Very well, Rebecca." Rebecca started on her journey the next morning. When she arrived 2 days later, she found her cousin in perfect health. She found, moreover, that the friend had not written the postscript in the cousin's letter. Rebecca would have returned to Ford Village the next morning, but the fatigue and nervous strain had been too much for her. She was not able to move from her bed. She had a species of low fever induced by anxiety and fatigue. But she could write, and she did, to the Slocums, and she received no answer. She also wrote to Mrs. Dent. She even sent numerous telegrams, with no response. Finally, she wrote to the postmaster, and an answer arrived by the first possible mail. The letter was short, curt, and to the purpose. Mr. Amblecrom, the postmaster, was a man of few words, and especially wary as to his expressions in a letter. "Dear Madam," he wrote, "your favor received. No Slocums in Ford's village. All dead. Addie 10 years ago, her mother 2 years later, her father 5. House vacant. Mrs. John Dent said to have neglected stepdaughter. Girl was sick. Medicine not given. Talk of taking action. Not enough evidence. House said to be haunted. Strange sights and sounds. Your niece, Agnes Dent, died a year ago, about this time. Yours truly, Thomas Amblecrom." End of The Wind in the Rosebush. Recording by Anne Simmons.
A Halloween Wraith by William Black. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. A Halloween Wraith by William Black. 1. The vast bulk of Ben Cleberick was dark in shadow, but the wide waters of Loch Naver shone a soft silver grey in the moonlight, as Hector McIntyre, keeper and forester in the far solitudes of Glencorn, came striding along the road toward Invermudal. As he approached the little hamlet, which consists merely of the inn and its surroundings, and 1 or 2 keepers' cottages, certain small points of red told him of its whereabouts among the black trees, and as he drew still nearer, he thought he would let the good people there know of his coming. Hector had brought his pipes with him, for there were to be great doings on this Halloween night, and now, when he had inflated the bag and tuned the drones, there sprang into the profound silence reigning everywhere around this wild skirl of the hills of Glenorchy. Surely the sound would reach and carry its message. If not, here was Gilead Rover, played still more bravely, and again the proud strains of the Glen's Mine, by which time he had got near to the inn, and was about to turn down from the highway by the semicircular drive passing the front door. But here he suddenly encountered a fearful sight. From out of the dusk of the wall surrounding the front garden, there came 3 luminous objects, 3 globes of a dull saffron hue, and on each of these appeared the features of a face, eyes, mouth, and nose, all flaming in fire. On beholding this terrible thing, the tall, brown-bearded forester turned and fled, and the pipes told of his dismay, for they shrieked and groaned and made all sorts of indescribable noises, as if they too were in mortal alarm. Then Mrs. Murray's 3 children, with victorious shouts of laughter, pursued the tall forester, and kept waving before them the hollowed-out turnips, with a bit of candle burning within. When he had got up to the corner of the road, Hector turned and addressed the children, who had come crowding round him, holding up their flaming turnips to cause him still further dismay. "Well now," said he, in the Gaelic, "there is a fearful thing to alarm any poor person with. Were you not thinking I should die of fright? And the pipes squealing as well, for they never saw anything like that before. But never mind, we are going down to the house now, and do you know, Roland and Isabel, and you, little Shayna, do you know, I have brought you some of the fir tops that grow in Glengorm. For it is a wonderful place, Glengorm, and the fir tops that grow on the larches there are not as the fir tops that grow anywhere else. They are very small, and they are round, and some are pink, and some are blue, and some are black and white, and some others, why, they have an almond inside them. Oh, it is a wonderful place, Glengorm. But it is not always you can get the fir tops from the larches. It is only on some great occasion like the Halloween night. And let me say now, if I put any of them in my pocket, here, Ronald, take the pipes from me, and hold them properly on your shoulder, for one day you will be playing Miss Ramsay Strathspey as well as any one, and I will search my pockets and say if I put any of those wonderful fir tops into them." The children knew very well what all this preamble meant. But neither they nor their elders could have told how it was that Hector McIntyre, every time he came to Invermoodal, brought with him packages of sweetmeats, though he lived in one of the most inaccessible districts in Sutherland, Glengorm being about 22 miles away from anywhere. However, here was a precious little parcels, and when they had been distributed, Hector took his pipes again, and escorted by his small friends, went down to the inn. Well, Mr. Murray, the innkeeper, had also heard the distant skirl of the pipes, and here he was at the door. "How are you, Hector?" he asked in Gaelic. "What is your news?" "There is not much news in Glengorm," was the answer. "And when is your wedding to be?" Mr. Murray said. "We will make a grand day of that, Hector. And I have been thinking I will get some of the lads to kindle a bonfire on the top of Ben Clebrig, a fire that they will see down in Rossshire. And there's many a pistol and many a gun will make a crack when you drive up to this door and bring your bride in, for I am one who believes in the old customs, and whether it is a wedding or the New Year or Halloween night, I am for the old ways, and the Free Church ministers can say what they like. Now come away in, Hector, my lad, and take a dram after your long walk. There is plenty of hard work before you this evening, for Johnny has broken his fiddle, and the lasses have not been asked to dance up a reel for many a day." And then he paused and said, "And how is Flora Campbell, Hector? Have you any news of her?" "No," said the forester, in something of an undertone, and his face looked troubled. "I have had no letter for a while back, and I do not know what it means. Her sister that lives in Greenock has taken ill, and Flora said she must go down from Oban to see her, and that is the last I have heard. If I knew her sister's address in Greenock, I would write and ask Flora why there was no letter so long. But if you send a letter to one called Mary Campbell in such a big place as Greenock, what use is it?" "But no news is good news, Hector," said Mr. Murray cheerfully. And therewith he led the way through a stone corridor into the great kitchen, where a considerable assemblage of lads and lasses were engaged in noisy merriment and pastime. The arrival of the tall forester and his pipes were hailed with general satisfaction, but there was no call as yet for the inspiring music. In fact, this big kitchen was given over to the games of the children and the younger boys and girls, a barn having been prepared for supper, and for the celebration of occult Halloween rites, when the time came for their elders to take part in the festivities. At present there was a large tub filled with water placed in the middle of the floor, and there were apples in it, and the youngsters, with their hands behind their backs, were trying to snatch out an apple with their teeth. There was many a sousing of heads, of course, in excellent trial of temper, while sometimes a bolder wight than usual would pursue his prize to the bottom and try to fasten upon it there, or some shy young damsel would cunningly shove the apple over to the side of the tub, and succeed by mother wit where masculine courage had failed. Then from the roof, suspended by a cord, hung a horizontal piece of wood, at one end of which was an apple, at the other a lighted tallow candle, and when the cord had been twisted up and set free again, causing the transverse piece of wood to whirl around, the competitor was invited to snatch with his mouth at the apple, failing to do which secured him a rap on the cheek from the guttering candle. There were all sorts of similar diversions going forward, the origin and symbolism of them little dreamt of by these light-hearted lads and lasses, when little Isabel Murray came up to the big, handsome, good-natured looking forester from Glengorm. "Will you burn a nut with me, Hector?" she said kindly. "Indeed I will, Isabel, if you will take me for your sweetheart," said he in reply. "And now we will go to the fire, and see whether we are to be at peace and friendship all our lives." They went to the hearth. They put the 2 nuts among the blazing pates, and awaited the response of the oracle. Could any augury have been more auspicious? The 2 nuts lay together, burning steadily and quickly, a soft love flame, no angry sputtering, no sudden explosion and separation. "Now do you see that lamb of my heart?" said the tall forester, using a familiar Gaelic phrase. And no doubt the little lass was very highly pleased. However, at this moment up came Mrs. Murray, with the announcement that the children might continue at their games some time longer, but that the grown-up folk were wanted in the barn, where supper was waiting them. It was a joyous scene. The huge peat fire was blazing brightly. The impoverished chandelier was studded with candles. There were a couple of lamps on the long table, which were otherwise most sumptuously furnished, and when Hector McIntyre, in his capacity of piper, had played the people into the stirring strains of the Marchioness of Tweeddale's Delight, He put the papes aside, and went and took the seat that had been reserved for him by the side of the fair-haired Nelly, who was very smartly dressed for this great occasion, as befitting the reigning beauty of the neighbourhood. "You'll be sorry that Flora is not here to-night," said the fair-haired damsel, rather saucily, to her brown-bearded companion. "And no one to take her place. I suppose there was no one in Sutherland good enough for you, Hector, that you must take up with the lass from Islay. And there is little need for you to dip your slave in the burn and hang it up to dry when you go to bed, so that the fire may show you your sweetheart. For well you know already who that is. Well, well, you will have no heart for the merry-making to-night, for a lad that has a sweetheart away in the south has no heart for anything." "You'll just mind this, Nelly," said the forester, "not to carry your merry-making too far this night. Alister Ross," he continued, glancing down the table toward the huge, rough, red-bearded drover who was seated there, "is not the man to be made a fool of, and if that young fellow Semple does not take heed, he will find himself gripped by the waist some fine dark evening and flung into Loch Naver." "Oh, you are like all the rest, Hector," said the coquettish Nelly, with some impatience. "Every one of you is jealous of Johnny Semple, because he is neatly dressed, and has good manners, and is civil-spoken." "What is he doing here at all?" said Hector, with a frown. "Is it a fine thing to see a young man idling about a place with his hands in his pockets, just because his uncle is the landlord? If he has learned his fine manners in the towns, why does he not earn his living in the towns? He is no use here." "Oh, no," said Nelly, with a toss of her head. "Perhaps he's not much use on the hill. Perhaps he could not set traps and shoot hawks. But he knows all the new songs from the theatre, and he can dance more steps than anyone in Sutherland." "Well, this is what I am telling you, Nelly," her companion said with some firmness. "I do not know what there is between you and Alister Ross. If there is anything, as people say, then do not make him an angry man. Let Semple alone. An honest lass should beware of a town dandy like that." Here this private little conversation was interrupted by Mr. Murray, who rose at the head of the table and called upon the company to fill their glasses. He wished to drink with them, as they did not seem loath. When Hector and his pretty companion found opportunity to resume their talk, he discovered that Nelly was in quite a different mood. "Well, now it is a good thing, Hector, that everyone knows that you and Flora are to be married, for I can talk to you without Alister getting red in the face with rage. And when we go out to pull the cabbage stalks, will you go with me? I know the way into the garden better than you, and we can both go blindfold if you will take my hand." "But what need is there for you to pull a cabbage stalk, lass?" said he. "Do you not know already what like your husband is to be?" Again the pretty Nelly tossed her head. "Who can tell what is to happen in the world?" "And maybe you would rather not pull a stalk that was tall and straight and strong. That would mean Alister," said the companion, glancing at her suspiciously. "Maybe you would rather find you had got hold of a withered old stump with a lot of earth at the root, a decrepit old man with plenty of money in the bank. Or maybe you are wishing for one that is slim and supple and not so tall, for one that might mean Johnny Simple." "I am wishing to know who the man is to be, and that is all," said Nelly, with some affectation of being offended. "And what harm can there be in doing what everyone else is doing?" However, not all Nelly's blandishments and petulant coquetries could induce Hector McIntyre to take part in this appeal to the divinations of the Kailyard, for when after supper the lads and lasses went away blindfold to pull the castock that was to reveal to them the figure and circumstances of their future spouse, the big forester remained to have a quick smoke with the married keepers and shepherds who had no interest in such matters. It was noticed that he was unusually grave, he who was ordinarily one of the lightest of the light-hearted. Naturally, they put it down to the fact that among all the merry-making and sweethearting and spying into the future of the young people, he alone had no companion, or rather not the companion whom he would have wished to have. For Flora, the young girl whom he was to marry, had left Invermoudal for the south in the preceding autumn, and when they had asked if Flora was quite well, and when he had answered, "Oh, yes," there was nothing further to be said. 2. Now, on All Hallows Eve, there is one form of incantation which is known to be extremely, nay, terribly potent when all others have failed. You go out by yourself, taking a handful of hemp seed with you. You get to a secluded place and begin to scatter the seed as you walk along the road. You say, "Hemp seed, I sow thee. Hemp seed, I sow thee. He who is to be my true love, appear now and show thee." And if you look furtively over your shoulder, you will behold the desired apparition following you. When Nelly came back from consulting the oracle of the Kailyard, it appeared that she had received what oracles generally vouchsafe, a doubtful answer. "What kind of custard did you pull, Nelly?" Hector asked of her. "Well," said she, "it is not much one way or the other. No, I cannot tell anything by it. But I am going out now to sow the hemp seed, Hector. I shall be far too frightened to look over my shoulder, and this is what I want you to do for me. You will stop at the door of the inn and hide yourself, and I will go up the road and sow the hemp seed, and if anything appears, you will see it. Will you do that, Hector? It is a clear night. You will be sure to see if there is anything." He did not seem in the mood for taking part in these superstitious observances, but he was good-natured, and eventually followed her to the door. The little walled garden in front of Invermudal Inn is shaped like a horseshoe, the two ends of the semicircle touching the main highway at some distance apart. He saw Nelly go up toward the main road, and looked after her absently and without interest. Nay, he was so little thinking of his promised watch that as she was some time over the sowing of the hemp seed, he left the shadow of the inn door and strolled away up the main road by the other fork of the semicircular drive. It was a beautiful, clear, moonlit night. His thoughts were far away from the Halloween diversions. He was recalling other evenings long ago, when Clebrig, as now, seemed joining earth and heaven, and when there was no sound but the murmuring of the burns through the trackless heather. The highway up there was white before him. On the other side was a plantation of young firs, black as jet. Not even the cry of a startled bird broke this perfect stillness. The wide world of mountains and lochs and moor was plunged in sleep profound. All at once his pipe, that he happened to be holding in his hand, dropped to his feet. There before him in the white highway, and between him and the black belt of the firs, stood Flora Campbell, regarding him with eyes that said nothing, but only stared in a somewhat sad way, as it seemed. He was not paralyzed with terror at all. He had no time to ask himself what she was doing here, or how she had come here. Flora Campbell, standing there in the road, and looking at him in silence. And then the horror came when suddenly he saw that the white highway was empty. He began to shake and shiver as if with extremity of cold. He did not move. He could not move. He knew what had happened to him now. Flora Campbell's wraith had appeared to him. But with what message? The steady gaze of her eyes had told him nothing. If they were anything, they were mournful. Perhaps it was a token of farewell. Perhaps it was an intimation of death. Hardly knowing what he did, and trembling in every limb, he advanced a step or two, so that he could command the whole length of the highway. There was no sign of any living thing there. He could not recall how it was she first appeared. He could not tell in what manner she had gone away. He only knew that for a few moments before, Flora had been regarding him with steady, plaintive eyes, and that now he was alone with this moonlit road and black plantation, and Clebrig rising far into the silent heavens. Then there arose in his heart a wild resolve that whatever this thing might portend, he must instantly make way for the south, to seek out Flora Campbell herself. She had something to say to him surely, though those mournful eyes conveyed no intelligible message. Nay, if she were dead, if this were but a mute farewell, must he not know? Dazed, bewildered, filled with terrible misgivings of he knew not what, he slowly went back to the inn. He had some vague instinct that he must ask Mr. Murray for the loan of a stick if he were to set out now to cross the leagues of wild and mountainous country that lie between Invermudal and the sea. Mr. Murray, as it chanced, was at the door. "God's sakes, Hector, what is the matter with you?" he exclaimed in alarm, for there was a strange look in his face. "I have seen something this night," was the answer, spoken slowly and in an undertone. "Nonsense, nonsense," the innkeeper said. "The heads of the young people are filled with foolishness on Halloween, as every one knows. But you are not to be frightened by their stories." "It has naught to do with Halloween," said Hector, still with his eyes fixed on the ground, as if seeking to recall something. "Do you know what I have seen this night? I have seen the wraith of Flora Campbell. Aye, as clear as daylight." "I do not believe it, Hector," said Mr. Murray. "You have been hearing all those stories of the witches and fairies on Halloween until your own head has been turned. Why, where did you see the wraith?" "Up there in the road, and as clear as daylight, for that is the truth. It was Flora herself," the tall forester made answer, not argumentatively, but as merely stating a fact that he knew. "And did she come forward to you, or did she go away from you?" Mr. Murray asked curiously. I am not sure," Hector said after a little hesitation. No, I could not say. Perhaps I was not thinking of her, but all at once I saw her between me and the plantation in the middle of the road, and for a moment I was not frightened. I thought it was Flora herself. Then she was gone. For you know what they say, Hector, Mr. Murray continued. When a wraith appears, it is to tell you of a great danger, and if it comes forward to you, then the danger is over. But if it goes away from you, the person is dead. Aye, aye, I've heard that too, Hector murmured, as if in sombre reverie. Then he looked up and said, I am going away to the south. Well, now, that is unfortunate, Hector, the good-natured innkeeper said to him, for tomorrow the mail comes north, and you will have to wait till the next day for the mail going south, to take you to the lairg to catch the train. I will not wait for the mail, answered the forester, who indeed knew little about travelling by railway. Tomorrow is Wednesday. It is the day the big steamer starts from Loch Inver. Perhaps I may be in time. Loch Inver! The other exclaimed. And how are you going to get to Loch Inver from here, Hector? Across the forest, was the simple reply. Across the Wraith forest and down by Loch Assynt. That will be a fearful journey through the night. I cannot rest here, Hector said. You will make some excuse for me to the lads and lasses. I will leave my pipes. Long Murdoch will do very well with them. And I will thank you to lend me a stick, Mr. Murray, for it will be a rough walk before I have done. Mr. Murray did more than that. He got his wife to make up a little packet of food, to which he added a flask of whisky, and these he took out for the young man, along with a shepherd's staff of stout hazel. Good-bye, Hector, said he. I hope you will find all well in the south. I do not know about that, the forester answered in an absent sort of fashion, but I must go and see. There will be no peace of mind for me. There would not be one moment's peace for me, otherwise, for who knows what Flora wanted to say to me. 3. It was an arduous task he had set before him. For 9 men out of 10 it would have been an impossible one. But this young forester's limbs knew not what fatigue was, and in his heart there burned a longing that could not be assuaged. Nor in ordinary circumstances would the loneliness of this night journey have mattered to him, but his nerves had been unstrung by the strange thing that had happened, and now, as he followed the shepherd's track that led away into the higher moorlands south of the Moudal river, he was conscious of some mysterious influence surrounding him that was of far more immediate concern than the mere number of miles, some 40 or 50, he had to accomplish before noon of the next day. Those vast solitudes into which he was penetrating were apparently quite voiceless and lifeless, and yet he felt as if they knew of his presence and were regarding him. A white stone on a dark heather-covered knoll would suddenly look like a human face, or again he would be startled by the moonlight shining on a small turn set among the black peat hogs. There was no moaning of the wind, but there was a distant murmuring of water. The rills were whispering to each other in the silence. As for the mountains, those lone sentinels, Ben Loyal and Ben Hope and Ben He, they also appeared to be looking down upon the desolate plain. But he did not heed them. They were too far away. It was the objects near him that seemed to know he was here, and to take sudden shapes as he went by. Soon he was without even a shepherd's track to guide him, but he knew the lay of the land, and he held on in a line that would avoid the lochs, the deeper burns, and the steep heights of Mial and Amare. The moonlight was of great help. Indeed, at this period of his long through-the-night tramp, he was chiefly engaged in trying to recall how it was he first became sensible that Flora Campbell's wraith appeared before him. He saw again, surely he would never forget to his dying day, the most insignificant feature of the scene, the stone wall of the garden, the white road, the wire fence of the other side, and the black plantation of spruce and pine. What had he been thinking about? Not about Nelly. She was some distance in another direction, busy with her charms and incantations. No, he could not tell. The sudden apparition had startled him out of all memory. But what he was most anxious to convince himself was that the phantom had come toward him, rather than gone away from him ere it disappeared. Mr. Murray's words had sunk deep, though he himself had been aware of the familiar superstition. But now all his endeavours to summon up an accurate recollection of what had taken place were of no avail. He knew not how he first became conscious that the wraith was there, Flora Campbell herself, as it seemed to him, nor how it was he suddenly found himself alone again. He had been terrified out of his senses. He had no power of observation left. This phantasm that looked so like a human being, that regarded him with pathetic eyes, that had some mysterious message to communicate, and yet was silent, had vanished as it had appeared. He could not tell how. The hours went by. The moon was sinking toward the western hills, and still he toiled on through his pathless waste, sometimes getting into treacherous swamps, again having to ford burns swollen by the recent rains. He was soaked through to the waist, but little he heeded that. His thoughts were of his steamer that was to leave Lochinver the next day. With the moon going down, darkness was slowly resuming her reign, and it became more difficult to make out the landmarks. But, at all events, the heavens remained clear, and he had the guidance of the stars. And still steadily and patiently and manfully he held on, getting across the streams that fed Loch Fiodag without much serious trouble, until eventually he struck the highway running southward from Loch Llyn, and knew that so far at least he was in the right direction. Leaving the Corrie Kinloch road again, he had once more to plunge into the trackless wilderness of rock and swamp and moorland, and the further he went through the black night, the less familiar was he with the country, for he had a general knowledge, and what matters half a dozen miles one way or the other. If only the dawn could show him Ben More on his left, and always before him the silver-grey waters of Loch Assynt. He was less conscious now of the sinister influences of these lonely solitudes. His nervous apprehensions had given way before this dogged resolve to get out of the western shores in time to catch the steamer. All his attention was given to determining his course by the vague outlines of the higher hills. A wind had arisen, a cold, raw wind it was, but he cared nothing for that, unless indeed it should bring a smour of rain and obliterate the landmarks altogether. How anxiously he prayed for the dawn! If this wind were to bring driving mists of rain, blotting out both earth and heaven, and limiting his visions to the space of moorland immediately surrounding him, where would be his guidance then? He could not grope his way along the slopes that lie beneath Loch Manscarrir, nor yet across the streams that fall into Loch Fionn. So all the more resolutely he held on, while as yet he could make out something of the land dark against the tremulous stars. Again and again he turned his head and scanned the east with a curious mingling of impatience and hope and longing, and at last, to his unspeakable joy, he was able to convince himself that the horizon there was giving up faint signs of the coming dawn. He went forward with a new confidence, with a lighter step. The horror of these awful solitudes would disappear with the declaring day. Surely, surely, when the world had grown white again, he would behold before him not this terrible black loneliness of mountains and mere, but the pleasant abodes of men and trees in the western ocean, and the red funnel steamer with its welcome smoke. The grey light in the east increased. He began to make out the features of the ground near him. He could tell a patch of heather from a deep hole, and could choose his way. The world seemed to broaden out. Everything, it is true, was as yet wan and spectral and ill-defined, but the silence was no longer awful. He had no further fear of the mists coming along to isolate him in the dark. By slow degrees, under the widening light of the sky, the various features of this wild country began to take more definite shape. Down there in the south lay the mighty mass of Ben More. On his right rose the sterile altitudes of Ben Uid, and at last, and quite suddenly, he came in view of the ruffled silvery surface of Loch Assynt, and the cottages of Incoadamph, and the grey ruins of the Ardrock castle on the promontory jutting out into the lake. The worst of the sore fight with solitude and the night was over. He gained the road, and his long swinging stride now stood him in good stead. Loch Assynt was soon left behind. He followed the windings of the river inward. Finally he came in sight of the scattered little hamlet facing the western sea, with its bridge and its church and its pleasant woods and slopes, looking all so cheerful and homelike. And there also was the red-funnelled Klausmann that was to carry him away to the south. 4. That long and difficult struggle to get out to the western coast in time had so far demanded all his energy and attention. But now, in enforced idleness, as the heavy steamer ploughed her way through the blue waters of the Mink, his mind could go back upon what had happened the preceding night, and could also look forward with all sorts of dark and indefinite forebodings. He began to recall his first association with Flora Campbell, when she came to Ochnaver Lodge to help the old housekeeper there. He remembered how neat and trim she looked when she walked into the Strathy Free Church of a Sunday morning, and how shy she was when he got to know her well enough to talk a little with her when they met in their native tongue. Their courtship and engagement had the entire approval of Flora's master and mistress, for the old housekeeper at the lodge was now past work, and they proposed to install Hector's wife in her place, and give her a permanent situation. The wedding was to be in February or March. In April the young wife was to move into the lodge to get it ready for the gentlemen coming up for the salmon fishing. When the fishing and shooting of the year was over, Flora could return to her husband's cottage and merely look in at the lodge from time to time to light a fire or two and keep the place aired. Meanwhile, for this present winter, she had taken a situation in Oban. She was a West Highland girl, and had remained there until summoned away to Greenock by the serious illness of her sister. Such was the situation. But who could tell now what was to become of all those fair prospects and plans? Was it to bid a last farewell to them, and to him that the young Highland girl had appeared, saying good-bye with such mournful eyes? The small parlour in his cottage, was she never to see the little adornments he had placed there, all for her sake? Well then, if what he feared had come true, no other woman should enter and take possession. There were dreams of Canada, of Cape Colony, of Australia in his brain, as he sat there with bent brow and heavy heart, taking hardly any heed of the new shores they were now nearing. This anguish of brooding became at length insupportable. In despair he went to the stevedore, and said he would be glad to lend a hand with a cargo as soon as the steamer was alongside the quay in Stornoway harbour. And right hard he worked too, hour after hour, feeding the steam crane that was swinging crates and boxes over and down into the hold. The time passed more easily in this fashion. His chum was a good-natured young fellow who seemed rather proud of his voice. At times he sang snatches of Gaelic songs, Mairi Pin, Meol, Shuliach, Mary of the Bewitching Eyes, or Ait in Kaidil and Ribbin, Where sleepest thou, dear maiden? They were familiar songs, but there was one still more familiar that woke strange echoes in his heart. For Flora Campbell was a West Country girl, and of course her favourite was the well-known Fierabata. I climbed the mountains and scanned the ocean, for thee, my boatman, with fond devotion. When shall I see thee? Today, tomorrow? Oh, do not leave me in lonely sorrow. O my boatman, ma horo ailia. O my boatman, na horo ailia. O my boatman, na horo ailia. O my boatman, na horo ailia. 100 farewells to you, wherever you may be going. That is how it begins in the English, but it was the Gaelic phrases that haunted his brain, and brought him remembrance of Flora's crooning voice, and of a certain autumn evening, when he and she and some others went all the way down Loch Naver to Invermoodal, Flora and he sitting together in the stern of the boat, and all of them singing the Fierabata. The clansmen left Stornoway that same night, groaning and thundering through the darkness on a way to Skye. Hector did not go below into the fore-cabin. He remained on deck, watching the solitary ray of some distant lighthouse, or perhaps turning his gaze upon the great throbbing vault overhead, where Cassiopeia sat, throned upon her silver chair. More than once an aerolite shot swiftly across the clear heavens, leaving a faint radiance for a second or so in its wake. But he took no heed of these portents now. In other circumstances they might mean something, but now a more direct summons had come to him from the unknown world. The message had been delivered, though he had been unable to understand it, and he knew that what was to happen had now happened in that far town of Greenock. And all the slow hours went by, his impatience and longing increasing almost to despair. The dark loom of land in the south appeared to come no nearer. The monotonous throbbing of the screws seemed as if it were to go on forever, and as yet there was no sign of the dawn. But the new day, which promised to be quite insupportable in its tedium and in its fears, in reality brought him some distraction, and that was welcome enough. At Portree there came on board a middle-aged man of rather mean aspect, with broken nose, long upper lip, and curiously set small grey eyes. He carried a big bag, which apparently held all his belongings, and that he threw on to the luggage on the forward deck. "Where's this going to?" called the stevedore. "Sure, 'tis bound for the same place as myself," said the newcomer facetiously. "And that's Philadelphia, begob." "We don't call there," retorted the stevedore dryly. "And you'd better stick to your bundle if you want to see it at Greenock." And very soon it became apparent that the advent of this excited and voluble Irishman had brought new life into the steerage portion of the ship. He had had a glass or two of whisky. He talked to everybody within hearing about himself, his plans, his former experiences of the United States, and when gravelled for lack of matter, he would fall back on one invariable refrain: "Oh, begob, the Americans are the boys." and in especial were his confidences bestowed on Hector McIntyre, the shy and reserved Highlander, listening passively and without protest to Parry's wild asseverations. "Oh, the Americans are the devils, and no mistake," he exclaimed. "But let me tell you this, sir, that there's one there's cleverer than them, and that's the Irish boy, begob. Sure, they talk about the German vote. Ah, blathershine. 'Tis the Irish vote, sir, that's the master. And we've got the newspapers. And where would the Republicans or the Democrats be without us? Tell me that I've ye place. In this old country the Irishman is a slave. In America he's the master, and every mother's son of them knows it. Ah, begob, sir, that's the place for a man. This old country isn't fit for a pig to live in. America's the place. You might bet your life on it, sir." And suddenly it occurred to Hector that he might gain some information even from this blathering fool. His thoughts had been running much on emigration during those lonely hours he had passed. If what he dreaded had really taken place, he would return no more to the lone moorlands and hills and lakes of Sutherlandshire. He would put the wide Atlantic between himself and certain memories. For him it would be Soraid Slan, Litier Mo Graith, a long farewell to Finnery. But at present the Irishman would not be questioned. The outflowing of his eloquence was not to be stopped. He was now dealing with the various classes and various institutions of Great Britain, on each of which he bestowed the same epithet, that of bloody. The government, the newspaper editors, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the clergy, the judges, the employers of labour, all were of the same ensanguined hue, and all were equally doomed to perdition as soon as Ireland had taken up a proper and inevitable position in America. Moreover, the tall and silent Highlander, as he sat and gazed upon the frothing creature, as if he were some strange phenomenon, some incomprehensible freak of nature, could not but see that the man was perfectly in earnest. "Look what they did to John Mitchell. Look at that now, John Mitchell." Hector had unfortunately never heard of John Mitchell, so he could not say anything. "Dying by the roadside, John Mitchell, to be left to die by the roadside. Oh, think of that now. What do you say to that now? John Mitchell being left to die by the roadside." There were sudden tears in the deep sunken grey eyes, and the Irishman made no concealment as he wiped them away with his red cotton handkerchief. "Well, I'm very sorry," Hector McIntyre replied in answer to this appeal, whoever he was. "But what could they have done for the poor man?" "They could have given him a place," the other retorted with a sudden blaze of anger. "All that John Mitchell wanted was a place. But they, ensanguined, government, would they do it? No, sir. They let him die by the roadside. John Mitchell, to die by the roadside." "Well, I am thinking," said the forester slowly, as was his way when he had to talk in English, "that if the government was to give places to all them that would like a place, why the whole country would be in the public service, and there would be no one left to till the land. And do they give you a place when you go to America?" "Ah, begob, sir," said the Irishman with a shrewd twinkle in his eye. "We get our share." Hector could not make out whether his new acquaintance had been to Portray to say good-bye to some friends before he crossed the Atlantic, or whether he had been engaged in the crofter agitation which was then attracting attention in Skye. On this latter subject Parry discoursed with a vehement volubility and a gay and audacious ignorance, but here Hector was on his own ground, and had to interfere. "I am thinking you will not be knowing much about it," he observed with a calm frankness. "The great Highland clearances, they were not made for deer at all. They were not made for sportsmen at all. They were made for sheep, as many a landlord knows to cost this day, when he has the sheep farms on his lands and cannot get them let. And the deer forests, they are the worst land in a country where the best land is poor, and if they were to be cut up into crofts tomorrow, there is not one crofter in 20 would be able to earn his living, even if he was to get the croft for no rent at all. Oh yes, I am as sorry as anyone for the poor people when they increase in their families on such poor land. But what would be the use of giving them more peat hogs and rocks? Can a man live whether neither deer nor sheep nor black cattle can live? And even the deer come down in the winter and go wandering for miles in search of a blade of bent grass. However, the Irishman could not accept these representations in any wise. He suspected this grave, brown-bearded Highlander of being an accomplice and hireling of the ensanguined landlords, and he might have gone on to denounce him, or even to provoke an appeal to fisticuffs, which would have been manifestly imprudent, had it not suddenly occurred to him that they might go down below and have a glass of whisky together. Hector saw him disappear into the fore cabin by himself, and was perhaps glad to be left alone. Steadily the great steamer clove her way upward by the islands of Rasay and Scalpa, through the narrows of Kyle Acane and Kyle Rhea, past the lighthouse and opening to Isle Orsney, and down toward the wooded shores of Armadale. The day was fair and still. The sea was of an almost summer-like blue, save for long swaths of silver calm. The sun shone on the lower green slopes that seemed so strangely voiceless, yet on the higher peaks and shoulders of the hills, where every corrie and watercourse was a thread of azure among the ethereal rose-greys of the far-reaching summits. Even the wild Ardnamurchan, the headland of the great waves, had not a flake of cloud clinging to its beetle cliffs, and the long smooth roll that came in from the outer ocean was almost imperceptible. Toward evening the clansmen sailed into Oban Bay. The world seemed all on fire, so far as sea and sky were concerned, but Kerrera lay in shadow, a cold and livid green, while between the crimson water and crimson heavens stood the distant mountains of Mole, and they had grown to be of a pale, clear, transparent rose-purple, so that they seemed a mere film thinner than any isinglass. 5. There was abundance of time for him to go ashore and make inquiries, but nothing had been heard of Flora Campbell since she had left. However, he managed to get the address of her sister, Mary Campbell, and with that in his possession he returned on board. Thereafter the monotonous voyage was resumed, away down by the long peninsula of Kentire, and round the Mole, up again through the estuary of the Clyde, until at 4 o'clock on the Friday afternoon the clansmen drew into Greenock Quay, and Hector McIntyre knew that within a few minutes he would learn what fate had in store for him for good or irretrievable ill. He found his way to the address that had been given him, a temperance hotel at which Mary Campbell was head laundry maid. But Mary Campbell was no longer there. She had been removed when she was taken ill, and as she would not go into a hospital, according to familiar prejudice amongst many of her class, lodgings had been found for her. Thither Hector went forthwith, to a slummy little by-street, where after many enquiries he found the land and the clothes that he sought. He ascended the grimy and dusky stone stairs. When he had nearly reached the top floor, he was met by a stout elderly man who had just shut a door behind him. "Is there one Mary Campbell living here?" he made bold to ask in English. "Aye, that there is," said the stranger, fixing keen eyes on him. "Are you come for news of her? I am the doctor." "Yes, yes," Hector said, but could say no more. His heart was beating like to choke him. He fixed his eyes on the doctor's face. "Ye'll be one of her Highland cousins, eh? Ye dinna look like a town-bred lad," said the brusque and burly doctor, with a sort of facetious good humour. Well, Mary is getting on right enough. You might as well go in and cheer her up a bit. The twa lasses dinna seem to have many friends." But Flora," said the forester, with his hungry, haggard eyes still watching every expression of the doctor's face. "The other one? Indeed, she has had the fever worse than her sister. I wasna sure one night but that she would go." McIntyre seemed to hear no more. Flora was alive, was within a few yards of him. He stood there quite dazed. His eyes were averted. He was breathing heavily. The doctor looked at him for a moment or two. "Maybe it's the sister you're anxious about," said he, bluntly. "Well, she's no out of the wood yet, but she has a fair chance. What, man, what's the matter with ye? It's not such ill news." No, it's very good news," Hector said in an undertone as if to himself. "I was fearing something. Can I see the lass? I was not hearing from her for a while." But he could not explain what had brought him hither. He instinctively knew that this south countryman would laugh at his Highland superstition, would say that his head had been stuffed full of Halloween nonsense, or that at most what he had imagined he had seen, and the fact that Flora Campbell had fallen seriously ill formed but a mere coincidence. "Oh yes, you can see her," the doctor said with rough good nature, "but I'll just go in beforehand to give her a bit of warning. You can talk to her sister for a minute or two. She's sitting up now, and soon she'll have to begin and nurse her sister, as her sister did her until she took the fever. Come away, lad. What's your name, did you say?" "Hector McIntyre. Flora will know very well where I am from." The doctor knocked at the door, which was presently opened by a young girl, and while he left Hector to talk to the elder sister, who was lying propped up on a rude couch in a rather shabby little apartment, he himself went into an inner room. When he came out, he again looked at Hector curiously. "Now I understand why you were so anxious," said he with a familiar smile. "How came ye to hear she was ill? She says she did not want ye to ken anything about it until she was on the high road to getting better." Hector did not answer him. He only looked toward the door that had been partially left open. "Go in, then," said the doctor, "and dinna stay over long, my lad, for she has little strength to waste in talking as yet." Timidly, like a schoolboy, this big strong man entered the sick room, and it was gently and on tiptoe, lest his heavily nailed boots should make any noise, that he went forward to the bedside. Flora lay there, pale and emaciated, but there was a smile of surprise and a welcome in the dark blue Highland eyes, and she tried to lift her wasted hand to meet his. What they had to say to each other was said in the Gaelic tongue. "It is sorry I am to see you like this," said he, sitting down and keeping her hand in his own, "but the doctor says you are now in a fair way to get better, and it is not from this town I am going until I take you with me, Flora, girl of my heart. The Sutherland air will be better for you than the Greenock air, and your sister Mary will come with you for a while, and both of you will take my little cottage, and Mrs. Matheson will give me a bed at Achnavel Lodge. I am sure Mr. Lennox would not object to that." "But Hector, how did he know that I was ill?" the sick girl said, and her eyes did not leave his eyes for a moment. "I was not wishing you to know I was ill, to give you trouble, till I could write to you that I was better." "How did I know?" he answered gravely. "It was you yourself who came to tell me." "What is it that you say, Hector?" she said, in some vague alarm. "On Halloween night," he continued, in the same serious, simple tones, "I was at Invermoodal. Perhaps I was not caring much for the diversions of the lads and lasses. I walked up the road by myself, and there your wraith appeared to me as clear as I see you now. When I went back and told Mr. Murray, he said, 'Did she come forward to you, Hector, or did she go away? She is in great danger. It is a warning, and if she went away from you, you will see her no more. But if she came forward, she is getting better. You will see Flora again.' I knew that myself, but I could not answer him, and my heart said to me that I must find out for myself, that I must go to seek you, and I set out that night and walked across the Ray forest to Loch Inver, and caught the steamer there. What I have been thinking since I left Loch Inver until this hour, I cannot tell you or to any one living." "Hector," she asked, "what night was Halloween night? I have not been thinking of such things." "It was the night of Tuesday," he answered. "And that," she said in a low voice, "was the night that my fever took the turn. Mary told me they did not expect me to be alive in the morning." "We will never speak of it again, Flora," said he, "for there are things that we do not understand." And then he added, "But now that I am in Greenock, it is in Greenock I mean to remain until I can take you away with me, and Mary too, for Sutherland air is better than Greenock air for a Highland lass. And sure I am that Mr. Lennox will not grudge me having a bed at Achnavel Lodge, and you will get familiar with the cottage, Flora, where I hope you will soon be mistress, and then there will be no more occasion for a great distance between you and me, or for the strange things that sometimes happen when people are separated the one from the other." End of The Halloween Wraith by William Black. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
There we go. Yeah, now this is going to be a pincushion for the hand. So, yeah, that's what it's going to be. There we go. I'm not going to worry about that too much. It's basically, so when I'm working, just use the elastic, run it over my finger, and then I just poke the needle in there instead. So, yeah, that's what I kind of had the thought to do and did it. Like this here, especially when you're traveling with these things in your bag, they get kind of a pain in the butt, so I made this little cover for it. And, like robots. See a need, fill a need. I don't know if I put a big enough elastic in there, but it was the one that was there. So yeah, just poke it there while you're working, and then especially when you're doing like a big blanket or something. You can't necessarily have your tools very close, especially a pincushion. So yeah, and it's a wearable pincushion. So thanks guys for joining me. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys had some fun and enjoyed the stories. I'm gonna go and have a nap myself. And, all that fun stuff. So, next time it'll be a couple of more stories from the same book. And, yeah, that's about it. Love you. See you later. Bye.